everybody, I'm Karl Wells. My guest today became very interested in researching the denominational education system of Newfoundland and Labrador in rural Newfoundland and Labrador. It's a really fascinating topic, and I wanted to have her in to talk more about it because I know you'll find it interesting as well. It's my pleasure to welcome Marie-Beth Wright.
Thank you.
Marie-Beth, first of all, why did you decide to focus on that period from, say, 1940 to 1969 when you researched this whole topic of denominational education in rural Newfoundland?
Well, it did tie in rather nicely with the probationer summer school, which operated within that period of time pretty much. I'm interested in research, as you said, in particular, and the demographics of these young teenage teachers who went out to teach all throughout the province, leaving the familiar, their families, their friends all behind, and setting out on this great adventure. It took a lot of courage, and it really impressed me.
Now, the thing that really shocked me was how young these teachers were. Some of them didn't even have grade 11.
Yeah, that is true.
And they were sent out to teach other children,
yes, exactly,
all across Newfoundland and Labrador. Why, in heaven's name, did we not have more teachers?
It's much as you're seeing even right now today, a shortage of teachers all across Canada, and headlines coming out of Quebec in particular, that if you're an adult who have graduated from high school, pretty much they are being looked to now to fill classrooms, hundreds and thousands of classrooms all across Quebec. This was in the period leading from the Commission of Government, and the normal school, which would be training teachers, they shut down temporarily in the middle of the 30s. They were soon revived again, but it could only graduate about 100 graduates a year, and that was far too few to fill all the gaps that was happening, much as in the Canadian context right now, due to low wages, working conditions that were quite desperate and unsatisfactory, and so there was a large gap, as you say, which led to the start of the 6-week probationer summer school, which trained teachers in a very short time to go out all around the island. Plus, as you say, sometimes if you were an outstanding student, you could be asked to teach like even half a day. I heard of one man in Newtown who was in school himself in the mornings. In the afternoon, he was teaching other pupils. This was Samuel Hefferman, who went on to become actually a cabinet minister with Joey Smallwood in years afterwards. So if you stood out, you were taken. So
how did they manage to teach, say, somebody from grade 9? Or grade 10.
When you're 17 or 16?
Yeah. How did they manage to teach them enough that they were confident that they could send them to the Northern Peninsula to teach children up there?
Yes.
How did they do it? How did they teach them?
Well, the license that was given was a probationer's license to begin with, so I guess it could be yanked away if it was some kind of not much learning going on or some kind of gross misconduct. Apart from that, there were supervisors, school supervisors who went around. They may not have gotten around the whole province in any one year, but they were seeing how the teacher taught. If it was lucky enough to be a 2 or 3 room school, the principal was watching or supervising the people in teaching the elementary grades. But you must remember, as you say, that a lot of these schools were sole charge or K to 12, and so therefore principal and teacher were all in one.
Yeah, it's amazing. I still can't get off.
Yes,
can't get over
and they were sometimes.
Were some people like turned away at the door and told, no, you're just not the kind of person we think will make a good teacher, or
I don't believe
did they
so.
all go on probation?
Yes, essentially that. And the first, if you did really well and you wanted to continue, you would go back in subsequent years to get a B license, a C license, and onward to what would be like the equivalent of a year of university. But with the supply and demand problem, very few were turned away if they could handle the 3 R's.
So how do they actually go about recruiting teachers? Did they have some kind of a recruitment campaign? Because some of these teachers came from other provinces, other parts of Canada.
Yes, and there was an article in the Down Home magazine a few years ago about 2 young Mennonite teachers who came from the prairies. And it was really astonishing to them once they had to reach their final destination by open boat. Missionary groups, church groups, were one source of these teachers. For instance, the Moravian missionaries came from Germany right back to the 18th century and taught down in northern Labrador to the Innu and so on, down in the Nain area. As well, Wilfred Grenfell was active in that period, so I would assume that recruiting teachers went along with recruiting doctors and nurses, and you'd see in the Grenfell run schools in the St. Anthony area. That would be one source. However, my cousin, Reverend Charles Green, at that time was a minister in the Burgeo Ramia, south coast area of Newfoundland. And as the board chair, as ministers would be, he would be very active in trying to recruit teachers. He told me, and he thought that about 80% of the teachers were actually native Newfoundlanders. So the infrastructure deficiencies and so on were no surprise to these teachers because they had just graduated from similar type schools, you see.
Now, the Trans-Canada across Newfoundland wasn't finished until 1965.
Yes.
You're going back to 1940.
Yes.
Through the 40s and 50s and up until 69. So there was a long period there when transportation in Newfoundland was limited, to say
Anything
the least.
but, yes.
So how did they get from St. John's, which is where I assume they were trained, to their destination, ultimate destination? They must have taken days in some cases.
Yeah, well, this probationer summer school would be all of July and probably a week or so of August. So then they would go back to their home communities, from which they would get a telegram in some cases saying proceed to a certain community on the Northern Peninsula or out in Trinity Bay somewhere, because a lot of the people I researched came from Bonavista and Trinity Bays or went there teaching. Sometimes from other parts of the island. So, of course, it would be going back then to the Reed railway system, and the Newfie Bullet was very much used by these teachers going to their various destinations, along with the coastal boat system. But if you were going a bit off the larger centres of Lewisport, Clarenville, and so on, then you would either go by branch railway line, or eventually, as you got to the coast, by open boat. One young lady told me of arriving in Harbour Lacou on the west coast, on the south coast rather, and being left on the wharf more or less with heavy suitcases, and then where to go. So it was the kindness of strangers in quite often who showed them how to get to their final destination. A man from Lumsden area told me how his mother was brought from Cape Friels down to Lumsden to teach by horse and sleigh. And I had an interesting comment from a young man from Trinity Bay. He said, I knew how to get there. This was to another community out around Norman's Cove somewhere. But he said, I didn't know where I was going. You knew physically how to get there, but they really didn't know what was in store for them and what they were up against with the assignment.
Well, let's talk about that. When they did finally reach the destination,
yes,
what kind of accommodations were made for them? I mean, what kind of living space were they given? And I imagine
yes,
it varied.
There weren't very many apartments to rent, believe me.
No apartment buildings.
No, exactly. And the school board itself would be instrumental in finding a boarding house in many cases. They went into homes with families. In some cases, they actually shared beds with someone in the family. And in the case of Salvation Army teachers, sometimes they were sort of billeted with the officers, the religious officers themselves. They would be sometimes finding accommodations that did not work out, so that it was necessary to move a second or a third time within the year. But in many cases, the boarding house became like a second family to them. Sometimes they married within the family and went back for the rest of their lives, or even settled down in the community. So the boarding house became the new mom and dad, pretty much, for these young 16 and 17-year-old teachers.
Now, let's talk about the schools.
Mm-hmm.
I imagine in some cases there wasn't even a school. I mean, it must have depended upon the size of the community. I mean,
yes,
what kind of facilities they had.
That's right.
In terms of classrooms.
And in some cases, this one building would also double as the church, so that if a clergy visited, a church service would also be held in that school building. But it's pretty much standard, and the kind of school I went to myself until I was in grade 7, which would be a 2 or a 3 room school. You had chalk for the chalkboard, a few geometrical shapes that could be used in teaching mathematics, the stove in the middle, no indoor plumbing. That was the system. And it's quite possible to view that kind of school even today in some of the heritage structures and museums that are around the province. I believe up on Blackhead Road there's what they call a school museum, which shows the system as it was. In Fogo there's a replica of a Roman Catholic schoolhouse still in effect as a museum. And if you were to visit the Barber Living Heritage Village in New West Valley, you will find that among the various buildings on site, there is one with a sign over it called the Old Methodist Schoolhouse. And in it you'll find as well a pump organ, because that would be very important for the lady teachers to be preparing students for concerts and this kind of thing. Mm-hmm.
Something I used to hear my parents talk about, now, you know, this would be going back to the 1920s, was the royal readers.
Yes.
What can you tell me about the royal readers?
Well, I was looking at one a few days ago because I was down in the education building, and they have a showcase there more or less full of textbooks of the past. And the royal readers, I think, was something that came out of the British educational system, much like the CHE exams did for the public exam system. So that's where some of the textbooks were coming from. You can go down and look at one right now in a showcase down in the education building.
Yeah, well, I actually have one or two at home.
Okay.
And I know, speaking again of my mother,
yes,
there were poems,
yes,
that she learned and had to memorize in school.
Oh, yes.
From those royal readers that she remembered up to the day she died.
Of course. Yes, exactly. That's how it would be.
It's amazing the impression.
Yes, and how spongy a young brain is, as you say, to take in information.
Yeah. Now, it was the denominational educational system.
Yes.
So I'm wondering, were these young teachers required to give any religious training at all? Any religious studies?
Not really. Until up to the 60s, the clergyman would come into the school, and as you say, in the particular church-run school, that's the minister that would come in. He would get you together, and I remember this, in the gymnasium or in a large room, and you would get religious instruction from the minister. On the other hand, in the other direction, teachers were asked to do church work. especially, for instance, in the Anglican system. Male teachers were quite often recruited to be lay readers on Sundays when the minister would be in another part of the parish. Depending on the crisis or the isolation, they would also be asked to perform funerals, emergency baptisms, and this kind of thing. And women teachers, of course, were recruited either to sing in the choir or quite often to be the church organist. And in the cases where the women married and stayed in the community, they became church organists for the rest of their lives in that particular community.
I'm just wondering, how many grades, like what would be the top number of grades one of these young teachers would have to teach? And were they basically trying to teach these youngsters the 3 R's, reading, writing, arithmetic?
Yeah, most definitely. Looking back into the training for the teachers themselves, there was when they were taught here in St. John's in the 6-week period, they also were taught a bit of physical education to have a few games, I guess, and they were also given speech classes to try and sort of have a level of likeness among the proper English that would be spoken where they were coming from so many different divergent Newfoundland communities. In the case of the all-grade school, the sole charge school as they called it, it was obvious that people in the higher grades were helping those in a few grades beneath them. It was something like if you have a family of 10 children and the older ones help to bring up the younger brother and sister. So I'm sure a lot of that had to go on in the classrooms as well.
Now, years ago, there used to be an awful lot of malnutrition in Newfoundland. People weren't being nourished as they should have been. I'm just wondering, did some of these young teachers have to kind of almost be social workers as well and be concerned about, the health and well-being of some of these youngsters they were trying to teach?
Well, again, I remember a young Catholic teacher from Trinity Bay who told me that she would be heartsick sometimes from either the lack of proper winter clothing and knowing that sometimes there was drunkenness and so on in the home, so that that was quite apparent with children sometimes coming to school. Of course, these were the days as well in the Commission of Government of cocoa malt. My brother remembers receiving that in school, and it was the seed or the forerunner, of course, almost of meals now, breakfast programs in schools at this moment. So yes, they were given.
So what was that? A drink, a powder that was mixed?
Yes, sort of a chocolatey.
Like Ovaltine or something like that.
Powder, and they would boil the kettle, I think, on the pot-bellied stove, and then pour it out, or the children would bring their own container or mug to put it in. Sometimes I think it was even taken and eaten dry.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
But it did have some kind, hopefully, of vitamins in it.
Yeah. Did any of these young teachers reach the point where they just kind of couldn't take it anymore, that where they just said, this is not for me, I've got to get out of here?
Well, that was very difficult to do, and I think it was almost strategic on the part of the Department of Education. Quite often, and in some years in particular, in years when there were even less teachers than others, teachers were settled much in the same way that ministers would be in a particular community of need. And it was quite obvious sometimes that if you were from the south coast, you would be sent down on the northern peninsula or far away from your own community. So it would be difficult to get back. One young lady from the now resettled community of Point Rosie, which is down around Buren, was sent in the Channel Port aux Basques area, and she recalled an official in the Department of Education saying to her, I'll send you far enough, you'll get home for Christmas, but certainly not for weekends. So again, to anchor back to the transportation system around the province, you really almost could not leave and go back.
Wow. Now, quite often, years ago, in remote Newfoundland and Labrador, the clergyman
Yes.
and the teacher were the only people who could read and write.
That is true.
And quite often, I remember my uncle was a United Church minister, and for years and years and years, he was called upon to write wills for people.
Yes, of course.
So these teachers must have been called upon to do all sorts of things by people in these communities, you know, fill in forms and...
That's right, and I remember that even from teachers who went out in the 60s, as you say, doing income tax for people, forms in the spring of the year, applying for unemployment insurance, writing letters for some reason or other. And I remember one lady, Mrs. Mabel Kane, who taught for over 40 years in the school system. She first went to a place called St. Paul's Island, and I think in Bonavista Bay, which is again now not there anymore. And she said she would have to send out requests for prescriptions as well and get them sent back by ferry, going back and forth to the island. Yes.
So, Marie-Beth, before we close, I want to talk to you about a couple of the icons of the rural teaching profession. Who was Pop Walters?
Okay, Pop Walters came from Pooch Cove, but spent most of his time, his career, teaching in the Bombay area, most notably in Woody Point, which became home for the family, and Norris's Point. Of course, he met his wife while teaching there, a young teacher herself, and their daughter, Lorna, tells me, who also was a teacher, she tells me how her father saved so many young boys in particular from quitting school, and the reason he was able to forge such a bond and loyalty with these young guys was by being their hockey coach, and he was also very active with the Army cadet movement. So of course they looked up to him and stayed on because it was like a two-way street. On the northeast coast, we would recognize Pop Walters more as being Heber Walters, who was the longtime mayor of Portugal Cove St. Philip's. He also came back from the Northern Peninsula area, worked with the Newfoundland Teachers Association, became an honorary member there. He was also very active with the Lay Readers Association of the Anglican Church and with the cadet movement going off to summer camps. And Lorna tells me if they go back to Woody Point, people would always ask, "Oh, is Pop Walters?" Yes.
I'll throw another name at you now. Alice Lacey.
Yes.
Tell me about Alice Lacey.
Alice Lacey is very synonymous with Wesleyville. And she actually taught my mother in 1925. She taught in a couple of elementary schools in Wesleyville. Interestingly enough, her principal with her at one point was Fred Rowe, who went on to become the education minister in the Smallwood cabinets. There's a very good interview done by Aram Silk in Munn Archives of Miss Lacey talking about where she came from and the long period in which she taught in Wesleyville. She taught music, of course, privately in the community, and she was on the board that set up the current museum in Wesleyville. So when I went to Wesleyville High School in grade 11 in 1962, Miss Lacey was there. She moved to the Central High School once that phenomenon started in the education system. She taught grade 7 there for a further 10 years. So when I went on the staff of that high school in 1969, Miss Lacey had just retired the previous June.
Wow.
Yes.
Yeah, you know, it's a small world because you know, your mom was taught by Miss Lacey. My father, who hailed from Wesleyville, was taught by Miss Lacey and Fred Rowe.
Yes.
So there you go.
That's right, all synced together.
I want to talk to you about your own career. And first of all, what was it like? You were taught in Valleyfield, so you came out through the small
United
school
Church
in Valleyfield.
system, even though I was an Anglican. But just for proximity, my parents sent me to the United Church system. I used to sing and perform in the United Church for concerts, and I had nothing at all to do with the Anglican system, apart from going there to do my CHE exams in grade 9 and 10.
Wow. Yeah. So you went to Memorial, studied education.
Yes.
What kind of career did you have in education?
Well, I taught French and English, and started off with Bishop Meaden High School in Badger's Key. That was an interesting feature as well, because in the United Church system, you were taught French. In the Anglican, Latin at that time. So it was very easy for me to get a position in a Anglican school because I had French, which so few Anglican teachers did. In total, in full-time teaching, it was about 12 years. But being a stay-at-home mom, working with the family business, I ended up having sort of an interrupted career. At the same time, it was a bit like a patchwork quilt, I said, because after my sons got into junior high and so on, I went back into substituting, short-term placements, night school, summer school, adult education, private tutoring, the works. And in fact, for 2 years, I was the English teacher in the Francophone, Provincial Francophone School Board here in St. John's. So it really is a patchwork quilt.
Yeah, well, you've been a great guest, and this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much,
Okay,
Marie-Beth Wright.
Okay.
And we'll see you again next time.